Welcome back to Joy Even on Your Worst Day. I'm glad that you're here. So this time we're picking up in the middle of the 18th verse in chapter 1. The apostle writes, I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. He's speaking of his deliverance there, not as a favorable verdict in court, or not even that he goes to glory. He's speaking of his deliverance in the sense that he knows he will remain faithful. He will not be ashamed of his witness to Jesus Christ. It's part of the apostle's mindset. He's not wondering how God has disappointed him by him finding himself in prison. No, he wants to make sure he doesn't disappoint God. It is a bold assertion and conviction in the apostle's heart. So Paul says, I rejoice. That's not a common reaction in our culture. When's the last time you said, I'll continue to rejoice? No, I'm not much like Paul there. I'm more like Alexander. Alexander said this, I went to bed with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair. And when I got out of bed, I tripped over my skateboard, and I accidentally dropped my sweater in the sink while the water was running, and I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. Alexander's day begins that way, and it goes from bad to worse. But Alexander's mother is in the story, and she offers words of wisdom. She does not say, now, Alexander, don't worry, I'm here, it's all going to be okay. No, she just says, yep, some days are like that. Some days are terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days. I think of Ben Weir. Ben and Carol Weir were missionaries for 30 years. And in the mid-1980s, Ben was taken hostage in Lebanon. He was teaching in Lebanon, and he was taken hostage in Beirut. For 16 months, he was held in captivity, most of that in isolation. And he tells of a time when he was brought together with another hostage, Father Martin Jinko. It was the first time he had been with another person other than his captors. They were suspicious. Why this change? Why allow them to be together? And then Ben spotted what he thought was a listening device. It dawned on him, they want to listen to our conversation. They had no intelligence, but they thought their captors wanted to hear their conversation, maybe pick up something. Ben told Father Jinko, I see a bug. Jinko reached for the listening device. It turned out not to be a bug. It was a solid air freshener. And then Ben said this, we laughed out loud. We laughed and laughed at my paranoia. My sides were hurting. He said, I had not laughed in 14 months. I had cried. I had smiled to myself on occasion. But now we shared in laughter, one of God's greatest gifts. You know, there's a healing power in laughter and joy. They are not quite the same thing. Laughter, joy, happiness, they're not quite the same, but they are cousins, if you will. And in this family of dispositions, joy is the deepest. Joy is the most mature. Happiness is dependent on circumstances being favorable, but joy rises above, even against circumstances that are anything but favorable. Joy is rooted in the confidence that the hardship in my life is not evidence that God has forgotten or abandoned or turned aside. No, joy rests in the confidence that the Spirit of Christ will bring my deliverance, and joy may be the first taste of that deliverance. Happiness is something that finds us, carried on the blessings of ordinary time. But joy is both at the same time. It is a gift, and it is something that is pursued. It is both a grace and something that requires discipline, even discipline with courage. David White says, joy is laying aside the anxious, worried self like a thankful death, and embracing a deep form of love. Joy as a form of love is relational. It is connecting, because this joy is not dependent on the circumstances of our lives. No, this joy comes from trusting that we are claimed by the ultimate and defining love of the world. So then it sounds like the mood begins to change a bit. In 21, Paul says this, "For to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you." My goodness, I'm hard pressed between the two, to live or to die. Has the confidence and joy of the apostle, has it slipped through his fingers? Well, it's hard to be positive all the time. They say that President Theodore Roosevelt in 1913, he took a small band of men and he went to South America to chart an uncharted, ink-black, 1,000-mile stretch of the Amazon River. It was a very risky trip, and he almost lost his life, which may have been the point, actually. For you see, the year before, Roosevelt had sought an unprecedented third term as president. He pulled out of the Republican Party and formed a third party. They took Onward Christian Soldiers as their battle hymn, and he told his supporters they were fighting Armageddon, but he was crushed in the election. And so, fearing that he might be defined by that failure, the old bull moose, as they called him, he went on this trip. The river that he was charting was called the River of Doubt. He told a friend, "You don't know how lonely it is for a man to be rejected by his own." Well, Paul was rejected by many, and we would find it understandable if he too found himself on his own river of doubt. I'm hard-pressed between the two. Do I live? Do I die? I don't know what I prefer. But then he changes and says, it's not about my preference. It's about what is necessary. And he says what is necessary is my ministry to you. I would rather die and be with Christ, but I'm going to stick around because you need me so badly. Wow, this is one of those places where Paul sounds a little arrogant. And you know, he probably was a little arrogant. But arrogance alone does not explain what is communicated here. He's speaking what is necessary. And in this, if I understand the text, the apostle is speaking of his sense of call. He is called. He understands himself to be part of a long, long story of God calling God's own. It reaches back, I guess, to that first call of God when God called light to be, let there be light. And it continues as God calls Abraham to go to a land that I will show you. And God calls the people of Moses to have no other gods before me. And God calls Jeremiah to be a prophet. And God says to Isaiah, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And Jesus said to fishermen, come and follow me. And for Paul, he is called to be the apostle and the pastor and the friend of this Philippian congregation. When Paul speaks of call, it's never about the one who is called. It's always about the one who is doing the calling. It's the one who does the calling that makes it necessary. You know, when we think of call, often we think of it as our passion. We find our passion, but Paul understands call more in a sense of responsibility. It's what's necessary. And that may not sound as attractive, but you understand it. It's calling like responding to the call that comes to a parent at 2 o'clock in the morning because a little child has got a fever. And there's very little passion, very little bliss in walking the squeaky floors in the middle of the night, humming and singing lullabies. But it's a calling. It's a responsibility. And because it's yours and because it's right, there's also a sense of peace about it, even a sense of joy. Paul says, I will stay because it is necessary. It is his calling. So his sense of call is connected to his relationship to the Philippians, and he says he is eager to come see them again. For there's a partnership here as he begins this section. He says, I know that I'm going to be delivered because of the work of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, but also because of you, because of your prayers for me. In February of 1968, Echo Cole and Robert Walker died suddenly and tragically in a horrible accident. They were sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. Official Memphis didn't respond much at all to this tragedy, but it launched a march and movement of protest demanding dignity for the African American community in Memphis and across the country. In April 3rd of that year, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he flew to Memphis to help with strategy and also to offer encouragement to those who were marching daily for their rights and dignity there in Memphis. It was the day before he was assassinated in that same city, April the 4th of 1968. That evening, Dr. King went to the Charles Mason Temple and he spoke to the crowds there. They were weary, but they were hoping. They pushed their way through a thunderstorm to meet him there. And he stood just hours before his death, and he closed his speech to them, his sermon to them, with these words. He said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And God has allowed me to go up the mountain and to look over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. You know, Dr. King has rightly been associated with the prophets of our spiritual tradition, of Amos, who demands that justice roll down like waters, of Isaiah, who envisions swords being beaten into plowshares. But here he sounds a lot like Paul. I just want to do God's will. I want to do what is necessary. But there's another way he sounds like Paul. Many of us recognize the ending of that speech, but at the beginning of that speech, he said this. He had been introduced by Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and King said this, as I listened to Ralph Abernathy in his eloquent and generous introduction and then thought about myself, I wondered, who is he talking about? It's always good to have your closest friend and associate say something good about you, and Ralph is the best friend that I have in this world. You know, that night, King was well aware there were many who were not his friend. He was speaking in the midst of a hateful nation. But he had Ralph. He had a friend who would say good things, and he had hope. He was confident that we would get to the promised land. And I think that friendship and that hope are tied. You see, it's what the apostle says. This will work out for my deliverance because the Spirit of Jesus Christ is at work. And so one day all of God's imprisoned people will be free. But he also says, this will work out for my deliverance because you, Philippians, you are my friends. You are praying for me. You are concerned for me. You are thinking of me. You are carrying me in your prayers. I think those are connected. And because the Spirit of Christ and the reality of friendship reveal and give birth to this hope, Paul rejoices. And thanks be to God, even for us, some days are like that.